So I'm very pleased to introduce Rahul Varma, who's the director of Teesri Duniya Theatre here in Montreal, and Anouck Carsignol, who is in Toronto, but she's a researcher that is affiliated with the CERIAS. And it's a different format from a previous presentation within this series on à la fois autochtones et indiens, réalités et enjeux adivasi en territoire sud-asiatique. Slightly different because it will be more in a mode of a discussion between Anouck and Rahul. So without any further delay, I will give you je vais vous laisser le tapis. Anouck, Rahul, merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Rahul Varma, for being here today and for joining this discussion on the role of art and in particular on the role of theater in the process of decolonization. Scholars Lohman and Barker define this idea of decolonization as the dismantling of the spaces, the systems, the stories of invasion that root settler people to a nation. And this idea of decolonization, Rahul Varma, is exactly what is at the heart of your project. So before we get into it, I would like to first acknowledge, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, that the land I live on in Toronto is the traditional land of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credits, the Anishinabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I acknowledge that my presence today was paved by colonialism and by systemic racism, and I am committed to honoring, listening, and learning from the perspectives of Indigenous people who are the custodians of the land on Turtle Island. So the conversation today aims at presenting how immigrants or multicultural theater can help decolonize the cultural landscape in Canada, and as a result, can help decolonize the very idea of the nation. In fact, studies on theater by scholars such as Yana Mirzan, Alan Filewood, or Rick Knowles have acknowledged the fact that there is a conflation between theater and the idea of the nation. Because theater not only represents and reflects this idea of a nation, but it also contributes to shape it. It is an ambivalent and political art form, which can indeed be both a factor of colonization, as it was in Canada until the 1980s, when there was a Eurocentric form of theater that predominated the cultural landscape. But it can also be a transgressive tool that questions the existing order. Immigrant theater in Canada, I'll give you a bit of a historical context. Immigrant theater in Canada emerged as early as the 1930s, and initially it was a very ethno-specific theater that was dedicated to diasporic or to immigrant communities themselves, and it relied on community support only. It was mostly absent from the mainstream theater. In the 1980s, the adoption of the multicultural politics by the Canadian government was followed by an increase in the recognition and the funding for non-mainstream theater companies, which were defined as multicultural. And this allowed the emergence of new theaters. It also allowed the professionalization of existing grassroots companies. So we will see how, over the last 40 years or so, a specific theater company, Teesri Duniya Theatre, has been defying the hegemonic culture, the racialized structure, and the dichotomies that defined Canada, and how it has challenged the politics of multiculturalism. We will also see how this socially engaged theater has been working relentlessly on stage, but also beyond the stage, to build bridges not only between mainstream and alternative theaters, but also between settlers, immigrants, and Indigenous people. Yes, so Rahul Varma, you are a playwright and you are the director of the Teesri Duniya Theatre in Montreal, and you're also a lifelong activist. And in your work, colonization is a recurrent theme. and you mobilize performing art as a way to counter it by promoting pluralism, cultural inclusivity, and social justice. Could you explain your itinerary and the reasons why you chose theater as a way not only to express yourself, but also as a tool for social change? And what inspired you, what outraged you, and what made you become this artistic activist that you are today?
Thank you, Anouck. Thank you for the question, and thank you, audience, for joining this session. So I'll start. So I came to Canada in 1976, and I formed the Teesri Duniya Theatre along with Rana Bose and some other colleagues in 1981. I was aware of the power of the performance in social change. So that awareness I had from before. And through the first few years of my coming to Canada, I also witnessed that the stage or any other expression platform, may that be cinema or TV or theater, it was without an exception monochromatically white. Anglo-French artists were intentionally presenting their work. They were aware of their bicolonial heritage divided by language, English and French, and which led them to do binational theater, binational performances, and theme of which was self-definition, self-interest, and in the process perpetuating colonialism and marginalizing anyone who was the political other. So naturally enough, the representation of the non-whites, including indigenous people in Anglo-French mainstream theater, was absent, and should be noted that it was absent by design. So some of the motivating factor for me to start the Teesri Duniya Theatre with my colleagues was that the diaspora, particularly the South Asian diaspora that I was once exposed to, it exoticized itself through the display of costumes and customs and food festivals and colors and so on and so forth in the name of art. And on the other hand, other extreme was the Anglo-French theater of the settlers, which monopolized most of the patronage presented to the theater, and it presented its work, and it had a control on the resources, and in the processes, it magnified the binational colonial theater. So Teesri Duniya Theatre was a reaction against both. It opposed the self-exoticization by the diaspora and the hegemony by the Anglo-French settlers. So coming to that, so the theater, therefore, with that understanding, started decidedly with a very political mandate. See, our maxim was to change the world one play at a time. And that is to say that we derive the substance from the fact that the theater by its very nature is subversive. And it attempts to change oppressive powers and effect change within the society. We believe that there is a relationship between the performance and change, and that makes theater politically transformative force. A transformative force in favor of social change is what encouraged me to use theater as a tool of activism. And I also thought that the added factor was the performance value. Because it is so beautiful, it is easy to entice and encourage people to consider the social change. So Anouck, that is my answer, that why I became in the end activist. Well, not in the end activist, that I already was activist, how I began to use theater as a tool of activism.
Thank you, Rahul. So I think we can give a bit of an overview of your different productions through the years to show the diversity of themes that you tackled. You have dedicated plays to very interconnected themes such as globalized capitalism, environment and development issues, which was the subject of your play Bhopal. You worked on the marginalization of Indigenous people in Canada, and we'll get back to that in a few minutes. You also dealt with migration and exploitation in a play called The No Man's Land. And you analyzed in a multi-layered way the interplay between domestic violence and racism in the play Counter-Offense. And I suggest that we watch a short extract of that play that illustrates your work and that shows the complexity of life in Canada for people who are facing both gender inequity issues, racism, socio-economic issues.
He seemed to love his wife a great deal, but she seemed bent on destroying him.
Am I being cruel to him?
No, Shazia.
Don't be ridiculous.
You're protecting yourself.
It's a restraining order. If you go within 100 yards above my friend, they will deport you. I chose Canada to be my home. But I hope that someday you will focus on values rather than the color of skin.
Look at my hands, I see my father's hands. You took the crime I committed against my wife, you made it. Crime against race.
I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
The whole truth and nothing
I
but
swear
the
to tell the truth, but the whole truth and nothing.
Truth and
truth.
nothing but
Tell the truth.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Rahul Varma, you might want to tell us a few words about this play in particular, and about your approach to different social issues that you interweave into one performance.
Sure. I think that the clipping that we showed just about a minute and a half was went a little wonky. So let me just explain this situation here. Is that and it pretty well ties up to what I described in the beginning, the kind of a contradiction that I was experiencing and witnessing in the diaspora community, as well as response outside of it. So the Counter-Offense is a play that is about the violence against women, which must end, but it's also a play about the racism, which also must end. And what do you do in a situation when the struggle to end the violence against women comes in conflict with the struggle to end racism? So the conflict in the play became the conflict of the virtue. The violence must end, racism must end, but the two are colliding. So that was the kind of a complexity that I was dealing in this play, raising the issue that there was conjugal abuse in the community that was not talked about, but also dealing with the issue that the mainstream society was addressing the conjugal abuse in the minority community, in the visible minority community, as a cultural matter, as opposed to in the mainstream community as a crime. I mean, it is a crime, so why should it be dealt as a culture in some community and crime in another? And that was the systemic disparity that existed in the society that I needed to address. So that was in some way the summary of the play. But other part also was that for the very first time in this play, the number of communities that were active and developed character into the same story was quite high. It had the Iranians, it had Indians, it had Black people, it had white people, it had South Asians, Anglophone and Francophone. So some of the critique that I received from the media at the time, that somebody is writing a play where everyone is on the stage. And my answer to them was, well, everybody lives on the street, so why shouldn't they not be on the stage? So it was a kind of a sensitization in the Quebec that the diversity exists, that despite the visibility of it, they were unable to see it. And we presented that in a very complex manner. So that was a little description of the Counter-Offense. Anouck, should I answer your question with regards to defining the diaspora and the intercultural theater?
Yes, absolutely. How would you define your theater?
Okay, so I think that in your introduction, you described that there was a mainstream theater and then there is immigrant theater. And you also said that, read the acknowledgement that that we are in this country because of the colonialism and the racism. In my opinion, any theater, except for the original theater, if it is not an immigrant theater, it's a colonial theater. And that is what existed there. So call it an immigrant theater or intercultural theater. Take a look at most of the big theaters and small Anglo-French theaters. In their composition and in their content, they are very colonial. And it's a systemic issue we have in this country because we have not written our history properly. That we think that the so-called founding of the country, which started, 150, 200 years ago, was the origin of Canada, and anybody who came, particularly mid-60s, mid-70s onwards, is an immigrant. That's wrong. We need to be able to believe that there are settler colonialists and settler immigrants in a very legal sense. I'm a settler immigrant. The Anglo-French are settler colonialists. But by definition, all theater in Canada, except Aboriginal, is an immigrant theater or intercultural theater, or in sometimes culturally specific theater. Now we are in the era of the EDI, the equity, diversity, and inclusion. And most of the mainstream theaters are rushing to prove their credentials by presenting more of the Aboriginal work or by presenting more of the work pertaining to the diverse community. And that's a bit disingenuous because they could have done it before, but there was a discrimination here. So this is an attempt, and a bit controversial statement I'm making. It's an attempt to continue to keep the resources in the hands of the few by co-opting the many. Now, the struggle for equality and the bridging the power imbalance are historical in Canada, and they are gender, they are class and race-based struggles. So yes, those categories such as immigrant or intercultural theater is essential. Still, the category should have a class and a gender consciousness, not the colonial heritage.
And indeed, diversity has been a specificity of your theater as early as the 1980s, and it was among the first theaters in Quebec to be intercultural. So what is also the way you are being true to this diversity is that you are using and you are interconnecting different localities and different temporalities and mixing them up together, connecting it to our reality in Canada, showing how everything is connected and how we have also responsibilities in what's happening in Bhopal or in the war in Iraq. So this is also something very specific from the Teesri Duniya theater.
Yeah.
Another specificity is that after each performance, you invite the audience to actually discuss the show, and you create this kind of sense of shared belonging. And this brings us back to this idea of a conflation between theater and community building. So I was curious about these discussions and what kind of synergy it creates between the audience and the actors.
So there are many reasons that I do that. And one of that is that, as I described, that the dominant Anglo-French theater is very hegemonic, and our educational system is predominantly very colonial. Our educational institutions are not defined by what they teach, but what they do not. Our theater, the mainstream theater, are not defined by what they produce, but what they do not. So there is a very notable absence of literature and the works of the non-whites and the New Canadians. And therefore, I emphasize certain things to take the didactical activities and try to find the many meanings and many ways to connect with the communities. One part of that is the development of the artist at a very individual level, for which I have a program called Fireworks, which is dedicated to developing the plays and the playwrights which are developed out of with the decolonial consciousness. The other one is the process of the theater production itself is very long. So if I decide to do a sort of a conventional theater, it often, by the time we decide to do to the time it gets produced, a long time passes. And so the activities are essential. Other activities are required. The kind that you are seeing on the screen, and often they are described as paratheatrical or didactical activities. But I think that beyond the professional theater, there are ways of connecting with the communities in more ways. And there are many other forms of doing theater: community engaged theater, testimonial theaters, the community theater with the non-actors and all that. And then it offers a little bit higher possibility of engaging them into a discussion which acts to the which works to support the idea of the transformation. So it is because of that I take some of those additional activity, and one of them was the alt theater. And if I get a chance to talk about it, I will speak that this is a magazine that we started for the purpose of encouraging the dialogue. See, the theater was, and the theater and all those performance activities that we did were very dedicated to social justice. The All Theater magazine was dedicated to dialogue. And since there was no dialogue at the intersection of the cultural diversity and the stage, we started, Rana and Kapil Baba and I founded this magazine, All Theater. And it was primarily, chief editor was Ted Little, who ran it for a very long time. So that was some of the explanation as to why I do the additional activities.
Yes, could you give us a word also on this initiative, sharing our stories, telling our lives?
Sharing our stories, telling our lives is a project dedicated to the mental health, particularly in the Afro-Canadian community. And the project itself was the collecting the stories from the members of the community, workshopping them and turning their stories into a form of a presentation, and then taking them back to the communities for presentation in order for us to remove the stigma associated with the mental health. So there was a kind of a summary of this, and this program ran very successfully. We ran it for about 1 year and went to many schools, many community centers. Great result came out of that. Yeah, and the people who participated were both actors and non-actors.
Thank you. So beyond the stage, you promote, so you organize these initiatives to reinforce this community building process. You also created these initiatives such as forums, conferences, protests, artistic gatherings. You organized one very recently in solidarity with women in Iran.
Yes.
You organize interactive therapeutic sessions for victims of trauma, such as sexual violence or racism. So could you tell us about these community-based initiatives, which aim not only at giving a voice to underrepresented minorities, but also facilitating a healing process for victims of trauma and raising awareness for public at large?
Yeah.
And you mentioned maybe the recent gathering in Montreal.
So thank you for the question, because you know, as I said, and I do not want to say this in the manner I'm going to, but professional theater has its limits. As I said, that by the time you decide to do a professional theater, something like counter offense, the duration of starting to write to production is almost 1 year, 2 years, something like that. In the meantime, a lot more goes on, and we continue to lose the news value, continues to lose the awareness that exists in the community. So to And the theater companies almost always realize that they exist from one production to another, but there a lot more happens in between. There's those in between, but very substantial activities, such as panel on Afghanistan that we organized when Biden government decided to pull the forces out of that, and they basically threw the government, threw the Afghani people to the mercy of the Taliban. So we organized this panel discussion, and it was a great involvement from the community. The preparation time was very less for us because the experts who spoke were the members of the community. So the theatrical element was just the manner in which we presented, but the knowledge was being shared from the members of the community who spoke. Very recent one on and the healing one was, because storytelling has an after effect. Because every story leaves some kind of an impact with you, which is transformative. So that's very common. Sometimes storytelling, sometimes theatrical production on a social issue also lead us to social action. And one of the good example of that is what we did very recently, just about a week ago, and we are planning to do in the next couple of weeks about Masha Amini, which is in the context of Masha Amini being murdered in Iran because she supposedly was wearing a hijab in a very wrong way. It gave us a little bit more issues to tackle, because in Quebec, there is also a situation where the government of Quebec is forcing Muslims, the Sikhs, the Jewish, and the indigenous people from not expressing, for not showing the visual dress code on their bodies. But issue in both those cases is not that. Neither the government of Quebec is right, nor is the Iranian government right. It's about the right of women to wear what they want to wear. No state must be determining what they should or what they should not. But on the other hand, these very basic issues have become a part where the government has begun to act to either curb or in some cases even kill people. So I do not want to wait 2 years to write a theater and present this story, because there is a very viable way to do that is by engaging the community through the para-theatrical activities of the kind that we are going to be presenting in 1 week, or we have just done in the last, so that we can capitalize on the news value and the timeliness of the issue, and have a much greater engagement, both of the actors and the non-actors.
Thank you. It's amazing to see how dynamic and how dynamic the theater is, and the way it engages the community in a very timely fashion. I also wanted to now orient the discussion on Indigenous people, which is one of the most marginalized communities in Canada, and for which you also dedicated plays and productions. So Teesri Duniya Theatre was, as I said, among the first intercultural companies in Quebec. It was also certainly the first one to tackle the oppression of Indigenous people. As early as 1990, Rahul Varma, you wrote an original play, which was called The Land Where the Trees Talk, that denounced the James Bay hydro mega project in northern Quebec, and that established a link between environmental tragedies and Indigenous rights. This play was interesting for two reasons. Why? Because the first reason was because it gave a voice to Indigenous people in an indirect way. But the second was that it was maybe one of the first calls for solidarity between immigrants and Indigenous people in Canada. In 1998, Teesri Duniya Theatre produced another play Where the Blood Mixes, which was this time written by an indigenous playwright, Kevin Loring, who's a member of the Nlaka Pamuk's First Nation. And I suggest that we watch a short extract of this play, and then we can discuss the solidarity between immigrants and indigenous people, and how theater can help challenge the dichotomy between settlers and indigenous people.
I was born in the heart. I was born in the deepest part. In the middle of it all, I was born. In the place where the rhythm beats. Deep inside my mother, where the rivers meet. My father drew me there. Where blood mixes with blood, and the sturgeon waits. And the wind sings the songs of the dead.
Let's come on. Oh, you want a piece of this? Maybe you're chicken shit. Oh, I'm not chicken shit. Come on. Then let's go. So if I win, I get your spot, right? Deal. I win, you don't fish here for the rest of the season. Oh, bullshit. The rest of the season. Come on, chicken shit. Oh, I'm not chicken shit. Ready? Set. Go. Woof. Ow! You cheated! No, I didn't.
Daddy,
What?
a woman came to school today.
Oh, yeah?
She asked me about you.
A woman. What does she want?
I don't know. She smelled bad. She smelled like stink.
She smelled like stink.
Uh-huh.
What did she want?
Well, she wanted to eat my bones like in the dream, like the Nishta. She wanted to get me and take me away.
Why would she want to do that?
She thinks you're bad.
How do you know she thinks I'm bad? What did she say?
She said that I needed a bath. She said that I looked hungry.
Did you get my letters?
Yeah. Yeah, I did.
Can I see you? I'd like to meet you.
Yeah, you can meet me if you want.
Are you sure? If you're not sure, it's okay, you know, I'll understand.
No. I'm sure.
Move!
Oh, shit.
Can I speak to you a moment? Hatshutsa!
Oh, Jesus, this is gonna be ugly.
We sat down last night, and I poured my heart and soul out, and you sat and you listened, and you promised me that you wouldn't steal from me, but you did, didn't you? Didn't you?
I didn't, Junebug, I didn't!
Anna was my best friend.
Well, I wish I could have known her.
Yeah.
The only thing I was ever told was that she died. I don't even have a picture of her.
She was so happy when you were born. Maybe we should go look for your dad, eh?
Okay! Oh my god! I can't believe I'm finally gonna get to meet him. I mean, like, I have these real old memories of him, but I can't remember his face, you know? It's more like a feeling, a smell.
Oh, I know that smell.
After all this time, Christine's come home. And that's the first thing she sees. Her old men fighting in the goddamn bar.
Well, you two should smarten up. What in hell is the matter with you two anyways? Acting like children. Like a couple of goddamn teenagers. Your whole life you act like children. I'm sick of it. Aren't you sick of it?
He started it.
So?
He started it, not me. I didn't start nothing.
Oh, shut up! This place is called Kamshin in our language. Most people say it's the place where the rivers meet. But an elder once told me that the real meaning is the place inside the heart where the blood mixes.
So, your family, they raised you good?
They loved me. When things were hard, they were there for me.
I always thought about you. Always wondered where you were. Always wondered where they took you.
I was moved around a lot at first. There are a couple of years that I don't remember at all. I remember feeling scared, alone. I felt abandoned, like something was missing inside, like maybe there was something wrong with me, and that's why you gave me away.
Listen like
Just
that.
let me, okay? I realized that I needed to come home.
This play by Kevin Loring shows the impact of the residential schools on the community. And by producing it, Rahul Varma, you give not only a voice to a community that was more or less invisible for a very long time on the cultural landscape in Canada. You give also Indigenous actors the power to perform their own story. For a very long time, not for a very long time, but since the 1960s, Indigenous people were actually subjects of some plays in the mainstream theaters, but they were never actors themselves. So by producing their own original play, you give them that power to perform their own stories. And also you create this awareness for the mainstream audience about the situation of Indigenous people, which contributes to not only healing for the marginalized community, but also reconciliation between settlers and First Nations. And beyond theaters, as we know, you don't stop on the stage. You also publish articles. You published one open letter on Alternatives International calling for a trial and not an apology from the Pope. So is this your way to try to challenge this dichotomy between settlers and First Nations as a newcomer, as someone who can offer a new perspective on the Canadian society?
Yes, it's one of the many ways that I continue to do that. But let's track a little bit of history. First of all, it was very nice to see that clipping because we did this play in 2012, and then later on in 2018, the French version of it, with in collaboration with Theatre Menuan Taguan, which is the first Indigenous French-speaking Indigenous theatre company. Actually, not the first, the second one. So just going back to this play called Land Where the Trees Talk, which I wrote, it was my first major English language play addressing the issue of the James Bay, which I saw had a very, very direct connection to another play that I wrote sometime later, Bhopal, because the binding thing between the two of them was the denial of social justice. The Land Where the Trees Talk happened to, we were preparing this play, and Oka crisis broke out at the time, and which the media began to present as a Oka crisis. There was a standoff on the street, which was a scene that already existed in the play that I had written. Many people began to call it Oka crisis, and I thought it was not a Oka crisis, it was a Canadian crisis, the Canadian crisis that Canada had refused to address, and therefore it kept occurring. And then of late, in between the plays and all that, a major, the media attention was drawn that Pope is coming, he's going to offer an apology. He offered no apology. And the whole shenanigan in the show was, he cannot offer an apology because they are not honest about it. So I had to say something about it. And I wrote this article in Alternative, also in Montreal, CERIAS. That said, this all is a background to what I'm going to say about why our company, despite even before the equity, diversity, inclusion, and so on and so forth, has been pretty dedicated to the plays that others refuse to do. You see, one of the very principle in theater is to do the plays that are marginalized by the mainstream. A mainstream continues to do the plays that are already popular, and there is no need for any discussion for that. So we take a little bit different approach. We do the plays that's marginalized by the mainstream. It is because of that we have this history of presenting the plays about indigenous community, about Palestine, about issues of genocide in countries like Armenia, and so as you know, that at the beginning you described the whole list of those things. So let me just contextualize this. The Canada, to me, is a historically settler colonial society, but a very genuine critique of the colonialism is complex. It is complex because the settlers did not leave. Instead, they created institutions and public policies that portray Canada as a constitutional democracy. And in that constitutional democracy, the word colonialism does not appear. It does not appear in the Constitutional Act of 1867 to 1982. And it does not appear in Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. So in the public imagination, it seems like Canada is a constitutional democracy, but it is built on by dispossessing the indigenous people of their resources and dishonoring the treaties. No justice is offered to indigenous, missing and murdered indigenous women. We continue to find the unmarked graves. Racial profiling is constantly growing up. Islamophobia is on the rise. Now, how do we explain these contradictions? A constitutional democracy on the one hand, and deprivation, denial, and injustice among the indigenous and racialized people on the other. Honest answer is this: the settlers are beneficiary of the colonialism. Hence, they have created a policy that masks colonialism by showing democracy, the rule of law, various constitutional acts designed to assimilate the historical victim of colonialism into a new colonial society. Now, what role the immigrant theater or the intercultural theater or the social justice theater can play in the process of decolonization? It must build an alliance with indigenous communities in raising awareness about restoring justice. Now, the reconciliation is only one part of discussion that we have in our country, but the restoring justice means acknowledging the capitalist plunder by settlers and putting policies in place for reparation, restitution, redistribution, re-education, and rewriting the history. See, the problem is the history is almost always written by the victors. This is what I experienced when I wrote the play State of Denial about Armenia. And this is what I see in this case, because those who are victorious, they write the history. It is up to their, it is up to them what they write. It is also up to them what they do not. And we have a lot of things that should have been written that have not been, because the writers are victorious and they need to hide some certain things. So if we do not have anything short of reparation, what it means is the historical colonialism is going to be transformed into historical hegemony. And immigrant theater like mine and many others that I know, we are against it. So we do the work that tries to counter it. Now, I believe that part of the question also was if there was a connection to the Adivasi population in India. Anouck, is that
I was going to ask you, yes, if we can draw a parallel between the situation of indigenous people in Canada and the one in India, the situation of Adivasis, given that actually Canada and India are both formally decolonized, plural, but still very unequal societies, where the First Nations are marginalized. And so my question was, first, is there a parallel? I think we can agree that there is one, but can performing art play a role in India as well in raising awareness about the situation of Adivasis and in having this transformative impact on the society?
Yes, yeah, definitely there is a role, and there is a connection between the Aboriginal situation here and that of the Adivasis. The thing is that denial of social justice to both communities is one of the connecting and the common factor. Both are living with the oppressors, and both are living with those who have taken away the resources from them, and both are struggling for the self-determination. And both are more diverse than homogeneous as we tend to believe.
That's right.
Now, so the issue here is this, that how do we solve this problem? As I described some time ago, that there is it's a constitutional democracy which does not acknowledge the colonialism. So how do we solve? The many frameworks have been used to solve we have set up the commissions, we have a feminist platform, we have the Marxist platform, we have national inquiries, we have commissions. I think all of them are inadequate. All of them are insufficient to address the indigenous problem. The reason is because in all of those concepts, there is an inner racism and inbuilt racism and inbuilt colonial consciousness. And therefore, they would not be right and the effective instrument to solve that. The struggle of indigenous people in both these countries is linked to the land, it is linked to the natural resources, it is linked to the climate, it is linked to tradition, it is linked to the nature. All these things are subject to the capitalist plunder and capitalist control. So we should not expect that happening. And it is there that culture has a role to play, because what cannot be done by the government, by the constitution, by our authorities, could be done at a level of generating the consciousness and the awareness among the people. And for that, I believe the theater and art is a good medium, and we continue to do that. Now, as I said in an earlier discussion, that their struggle is linked to the land, natural resources, climate, traditions, and nature. But their need is not a commission, not to go on inquiry, and not to set up studies, but a total reparation, total restitution, total retribution, total re-education, total rewriting the history. And it is therefore, Anouck, at the beginning I was saying, and your land acknowledgements were very good because it talked about the word commitment. Because mere acknowledgement is not sufficient. And that is the existing frameworks, even the agreements about the treaties and the many agreements that have been made between the government and public institutions to read the acknowledgement, unless we put power to turn the acknowledgement into a commitment to reparation, this thing will not happen. So, and culture has a role to play. So like I'm talking about this, and hopefully this will reach many people.
Thank you, Rahul Varma. That's a very powerful statement. And it brings us to our conclusion on the role and the impact of theater and culture at large, not only on our perception on our imagination of what the nation is and should be, but also maybe on the structures of the society. How can theater actually have any impact on the politics of multiculturalism? And I think it had in the past, it had pushed the government to refine its politics and to give this idea of diversity, inclusion, and equity a truer meaning. To finish this discussion with a statement from Alan Filewood, who said, a conversation about immigrant and theater in Canada must begin with the acknowledgement that theater is deeply complicit in the ongoing colonial project of invasion, subjugation, and extraction on indigenous land. And that is what you were exactly saying, Rahul Varma. Yeah. So as we acknowledge it and we fully understand that these marginalized communities need reparation. Still, I would like to finish on an optimistic note and observe the progress that has been made from the 70s, the 80s until now, with the emergence, the birth of new theater companies that are more diverse, more intercultural. The multiplication of indigenous theaters as well, that have been encouraged by the politics of multiculturalism and by this effort of reconciliation between communities. And there is one striking example, which is the fact that in Stratford Festival, which is the quintessence of the mainstream theater, if we can say, there are now indigenous plays being produced. So there is a slow recognition and incorporation of diverse contributions to culture into the mainstream theater in Canada. Would you agree with this statement?
Yes, with the qualification, because the Stratford Theatre has probably 1/4 of the money that government dispenses to the theater companies. It's a very major institution. It's a very Eurocentric institution. Yes. Mm-hmm. It has so much of money, but that it also, if it had the consciousness, it could have been doing all of that above, but it kept doing Shakespeare, which is not bad, but the problem with
what Canada is.
Well, the problem with the oversaturation of Shakespeare is the exclusion of all others. I mean, there are Habib Tanveers, there are Market Theatre of South Africa, there is Ajoga Theatre of Pakistan. So when you constantly present a very European version whose worldview is to the power struggle in the Europe and a behavior base, you are perpetuating a very colonial idea. We need to decolonize the system by alternate ways, not by repeating and renewing the same old ways. So my question here is, I'm very happy to see the Stratford Festival is beginning to do the Aboriginal theatre. I'm very happy to see in the National Arts Center, we have a person of color going to be doing the artistic directorship, and many of the bigger theatre companies are hiring the artistic leaders who are people of color. Question is, what's their connection to the community, and why couldn't they not have done this all before? So the struggle was launched, and that struggle forced them to do that. Good, that's a good on the resume of the struggle. But we need to build the alternate institutions. Alternate institutions run by Aboriginal people, run by the people of color who have the true awareness of the decolonization. And resources must be assigned to them to be able to do the things with the same flair as big institutions do. You see, the big institution by their very nature cannot be very political. So it may be very much face-saving rather than the politics of decolonization.
Thank you. And maybe, Mathieu, if I have time for one last question, which is now, it is a bit more personal, Rahul Varma, but I would like to go back to this motto that you set up, the goal that you set up for the theater, which is to change the world one play at a time. And so I would like to know how this journey in artistic activism have changed you, and what did you learn about the power and the limits of socially engaged theater?
It's growing every day. If you see that there is the kind of subjects that I continue to tackle personally, as well as through other writers and other artists associated with the company, we are neither ethnocentric in expressing ourselves, nor one issue company of doing more of the same all in all. I think that our world vision is to find global unity, making the connection with and addressing the issue of the marginalized people. So more I do this work, more I learn how to do it better and how to address the issues that other people have not addressed, and at the same time do them with the artistic beauty. So that is a global goal. It is not, it is unaltered. In the process, I have, and my company has made connections with various other institutions that are working on the social justice cause. You see, we politically conscious. Very often in the theater, we say that it's about the self-awareness. That is one of the very common thing among the Western artists. But the self-awareness is not an issue. You do not do theater to show your self-awareness. You do the theater to address people's issue. So we do a little bit, what matters to others and not what matters to the individual artist. So most of the artists that I work with and most artists who present the work here, they have something to dedicate to the underclass of our society. So to answer your question, Anouck, it's the expansion of the consciousness. That's how I would describe, because the idea of the change the world one plate at a time, it signifies the fact that there was a need for us to change the way situations were, and that need continues. A play Counter-Offense is a very good example. Very first time I presented the Counter-Offense was 1995, and then 1997, and then French version in 2001. It addressed the issue of the social violence against women and the racism at that time. Now in 2020, I presented the same play at the Siegel Center, which was shut down in 2 days because of the COVID. And my director, Ariana Bardesono, in her note wrote that she wishes that the situation has changed from 1995 to 2020. Unfortunately, it did not change. So the need for us to constantly keep working on it is always there. And therefore, there is absolutely no compromise. And the idea of changing the world, changing the mentality, changing the decolonization consciousness has to continue to grow. So I believe that's how I'm changing myself. Hopefully, it will encourage other artists to do the same.
Thank you, Rahul Varma, and we are now open to discussions and questions.
I wish to thank you both, Anouck and Rahul, for this very stimulating discussion. It's a discussion that I thought was mainly on Teesri Duniya theater, but I realized that there are many, as you said, theatrical activities that gravitates around the theater that you've started, Rahul, and that all these activities are aiming at creating a consciousness about colonization, but even more about creating a commitment to change things. And in French, I often tell my friends, my students, that it's important that les bottines suivent les babines, that to walk the talk, or in Pali or Sanskrit, yatakari tatavadi, yatavadi tatakari. And I think that's what you're aiming at doing. So chapeau, thank you very much. It's very, very appreciated. So yes, indeed, if there are questions, comments.
I've been asked to share the references, so maybe I can put them up for a few minutes. There's a small bibliography at the end of our slide. Mathieu, is that okay?
Yes, very much. And I think Diana Dimitrova has a question as well, or a comment.
Yeah, should I wait for the screen to be shared, Matthew, or maybe people want to take notes?
You can ask your question at the same
okay,
time.
okay,
And,
yeah,
yes.
yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Rahul and Anouck, for this wonderful discussion. And sorry for being late. I had to teach. Yeah. Anyways, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk, and I think it's very important. And I completely agree that that's the role of theater and culture, right? To alert us to all these issues that society cannot kind of, address or change. Sometimes poets and playwrights are ahead of times, and they kind of show us maybe the way. My question is about the form, about the theatrical form, right? On the one hand, I understand that it's very important to have indigenous plays by indigenous playwrights in indigenous theatrical modes, right? But on the other hand, I'm thinking, even if it's like a different mode, like a mode that theatrical kind of form that comes from the West, right? As long as it asks the right questions and kind of addresses the right issues, I think that it could also be very helpful, and maybe it can even appeal to a larger audience. So I'm not sure whether we want to discard immediately, like, I'm not talking here of Shakespeare, but it could be like naturalistic theater or something else. But as long as it kind of talks to questions of the marginalized people, I think it's also important. I'm not sure how Rahul sees all that, but in a way we need both, I would say, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when I was talking about, particularly with reference to the Stratford and Shakespeare, I mean, let me just make an admission here, is that when I start reading Shakespeare's English, it's very hard for me. So watching it makes more of a sense than reading. We cannot dismiss, we cannot write it off. At no point, my point is to say that the work is not to the quality and not meaningful. It is very political. It is multi-opinion. It was written at a time, and at that given time, in a kind of a power structure that existed, it addressed that, no question about it. The thing is about the Stratford, the thing is about our system talking about the equity, diversity, and inclusion, and at the same time maintaining the powers still in the hands of the same very people who have so far benefited from the capitalist plunder and colonial system. Now, do they have the right to do the play? Of course they. And there is a very active debate, very sensitive debate across the country that when those plays are to be done, who is to act in them as a character? I believe that when it is indigenous representation, it should be by indigenous person, indigenous artists, because they are there to tell their story. Their story lives in their body. Whatever kind of a training you have had, you cannot simulate the trauma, the intergenerational trauma, the intergenerational experience that lives in the bodies of the indigenous actors. So to do a play on indigenous theme with non-indigenous actors is a no-no. It should not be done. It simply means that you have not learned how to do the theater. But to do the theater by all companies about the subjects pertaining to all these communities, it should be done with their permission, with their engagement, and in a form of exchange. No question about it. I am not asking for somebody not doing. I'm only saying do it well, do it better, do it thoughtfully.
Yes, if I can also add one more thing about this question. There was, in the 60s, as I said at some point during the presentation, the indigenous people were represented during the plays, but they were represented by non-indigenous actors or some of the themes, some of their stories were enacted by non-Indigenous actors. And on the reverse, there was one case in 1961 when there was this King Lear play that was set up in an Inuit setting without any Inuit people. And the playwright and the team has done some research with the museum to find out the costumes and to try to give some authenticity to the play. But we can imagine that without involving the community, the members of the community themselves, they will never be able to really reflect life in, in an Inuit community. And also, what is the point, I will say? It is somehow quite questionable, knowing that Inuit and Indigenous people have a very long history of storytelling, of dancing, singing, and organizing ceremonies that are truly a performing arts. So there is some interest in hybrid performances, as long as people are involved, people from the community participate themselves.
Yeah, I think that the most authentic expression is about the indigeneity is indigenous people themselves. But what it is talking about is that the indigenous people still do not have the resources to tell their stories. So they have to rely on someone else to do that. That should not happen. I think that it's a plot, because the West, particularly the Western cinema, is doing all those stories about the Vietnam War, and representation of the Vietnamese is very shabby, and white actors are chosen to do the non-white roles, and idea is said that we take the best of the actors. Well, they are not best of the actors. Robert Lepage continues to do things. Very recently, the Slav. I mean, he presents these very beautiful looking white women dressed in white dress, picking cotton and thinking that their acting ability was good enough to represent the cotton trade. No, it was not. It just looked horrible. But he gets away with this because of his persona. And the Quebec is absolutely silent about it. None of those artists ever say that this is wrong. So the idea of the quality is used always to marginalize the people whose stories are being told. Now, I do the intercultural theater. There are characters from those communities in the same play. Interculturalism can live in the same play. There could be the cultural exchange. So let's not give room to constantly finding the ways to keep the resources in the hands of the dominant few. I was very happy that the Théâtre Nouveau Monde canceled Robert Lepage's work. I think he is absolutely not thinking right when he does this work, and he doesn't understand. And he's the icon. So we have to be able, the very important part is, story is about something, but the character is a representation. So anybody could write any story they want to do, but the character has to be authentic, because that character represents the history, represents the heritage, represents personality, represents behaviors, represents the socio-cultural relationship. I am not opposed to white people writing about non-white people. I'm not opposed to non-white people writing about white people. But if you determine a character who is Black or who is South Asian, and that is a matter of not identity, that's a matter of representation. It should be truthfully authentic.
Yeah, I would like to share an experience I had recently, and I'd like to have your comment on it. I went to Denise Pelletier recently, maybe 3 weeks ago, to see a play. Denise Pelletier, for those who don't know, is a very, very francophone white theater, well established in Montreal, and they usually receive schools, high school students in the day. And And it was a play based on Camus, L'étranger. And as you know, it occurs in North Africa. And there was a non-white actor there who's of North African origin. And of course, he played l'Arabe, you know. So he fit the bill. But I wish that he played Le Pied Noir, or that he played, I wish he could have taken another role.
Yeah.
That you know, why? And similarly, you know, it also brings to mind Peter Brook's Mahabharata.
Yeah.
You know, where Shiva is played by a Japanese actor, you know,
Yeah.
to me, and Bhima by a black person, you know, and to me that was so ingenious. It was so badly received in India. So how do you feel about these two things?
Well, as I said, that my concept still remains the same, that character represents history. I do think that the Peter Brook's Mahabharata was not ethnocentric in any favor. It was truly internationalist. So I can understand why Indians will object, because, but I did not see the problem with that, because the universality in Peter Brook's Mahabharata. And I mean, it's very interesting that the Indian people always say that the Mahabharata is so global, so universal, so what's wrong, when he represented that with the universal characters. And I think the selection, the choice of the actors, the way Mr. Brooks had made, was very thoughtful, because every character and the nationality also represented certain kind of the historical lineage that was in the body of that character. But by coming off of this in other plays, as I said, the writers have a right to write anything, but the characters, when they go on the stage, they are a representation of a particular culture. Now, think about it. When people make a call for auditioning for Shakespeare, they make a demand that, do you have the Shakespearean training? Do you have a Shakespearean accent? Which I don't, so I would never audition for it. So if that is considered authentic, why is a representation of culture is not an authentic thing on the stage? So it's a question about the, you know, power. It's question about how people, how resources are still in the hands of those people who have the exotic idea, who not only do not understand what the diversity is, but in their opinion, what diversity ought to be, as if it is devoid of history and could be performed by everyone. But take the, I mean, the more blatant example of that are these Hollywood films all about the Vietnam War or war in Cambodia. I mean, look at, I mean, those actors, first of all, the way they are represented Oriental women, the way Robert Lepage represents Oriental women is horrible. So it was not just the representation of an Oriental woman on the screen. It was a certain fantasy, that the Western fantasy that lived in demeaning a brown woman. So we have to be able to look at these things much deeper and beyond just the beyond just these some of those theatrical practices. And these big institutions, Matthew, the theater, then Denis Pelletier and Nouveau Monde and all, they do have all the resources to do the proper casting.
Yes, but that was proper casting.
Yeah.
The Arab was played by an Arab.
Oh, fair enough.
But I wish he played someone else. I wish he was the main actor, you know?
Yeah, and you know,
to me, he was the best actor on stage.
And it is very interesting because the issue is complex. It is not very simple. Say, for example, many of the actors from Latin America are they have both. They are brown actors, but they are also colored actors. So, you know, there is a little bit of an advantage they have, which is the hybridity of the nationality, and the color can play a role with them. But every time we are talking about people of color who are distinguished by this color of their skin, we are talking also about a history of what has happened to them. And that should not be minimized. So that's carefulness with which we should address this issue. Yeah.
I think Diana has a question, and it will be the last questions because we
Yeah,
should
if I may, unless,
try
I
to
mean, I
end
already
by.
asked the question. If anyone else wants to ask a question, I can just withdraw. I mean, that's just the last question. Right?
Go ahead, Diana.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah. No, this is such a complex issue. So, Rahul, I see your point, but I just want to tell you that sometimes I wish that Draupadi in Mahabharata, in Peter Brook's Mahabharata, was not played by an Indian actress. You know, sometimes I'm thinking this leads us into gender. Would it have been the same movie, right? Anyways, it's a big discussion.
Yeah.
But, you know, like the other thing is that you know, when you talk about white people, whatever, you know, there are also many I mean, lots of diversities among white people, you know, white people, like, for example, take any Hollywood movie, you know, that deals with some sort of bad guys from Germany or Russia or whatever. There's American actors
Yeah.
that speak with a horrible accent, you know, but they represent someone, or French actors or whatever, you know, or French characters, you know. So somehow we swallow it, right? Like we see an American actor kind of torturing us through his
Yeah.
or Russian or whatever, or Arabic sometimes, you know. So there are problems related with that, but I kind of agree with Matthew that real empowerment is when you make, you know, what you call, you know, the visible minority actor like the main character. You know, this is really true empowerment, and not just stereotyping them in a marginal role. So sometimes it's important to represent the culture, but in a way we all represent the cultures, right? So I'm not sure how to resolve this. Maybe in theater is different than in film. But I'm always happy when I see, let's say, someone whom you would not expect to see in the main role, like playing. You know, that's for me. And I think that people fought about for that. You know, like black actors, whatever. They really, you know, said, why are we always playing supporting roles? You know, like it changed. Women, why are we always, you know, kind of, you know, supporting them? So it's a way also of empowering, you know, people and cultures, I think.
Absolutely. I think that one of the very good example of the war plays that happened after 9/11, the representation. I mean, Canada wrote many plays pertaining to the war, about the war, including me, and mine was produced only in Montreal and nowhere else. All other plays were produced all over, including on the CBC. A representation of the people of Afghanistan and those of the Iraq was done by white people, and the story was almost always was that the returning soldiers were coming with the trauma. The story was not that they had gone to kill. So this and those roles. I wrote the play, The Truth and Treason, in which some of the commentators commented that it was good to see the Iraqis representing themselves. But when I write about, and I think that I agree that one of the culturally sensitive dramaturgy that we would like to promote is that when you write a character, you are not writing good things about them, but you're writing complete things about them. So my role as a writer is not that of upholding the goodness of the community, but the critiquing the culture. So as long it is comprehensive, it does not matter whether it is a good character or a bad character, but it should be complete character and a full character. We need to be able to have that dramaturgical understanding ingrained into our head. So we will therefore then we will stop presenting the Muslim people as a doorman and a terrorist, and the Black people as a drug dealer or into illicit businesses kind of a thing. The snap rolls that colored people come for couple of minutes and only to do the bad or the exotic thing must stop at a dramaturgical level.
Well, I think we need to conclude here. Rahul, Anouck, thank you very much. This was a very stimulating discussion. It raised a lot of issues, and I really appreciate. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here today.